Welcome to Brainfluence. I'm Roger Dooley. Today's guest is Scott Rick, a marketing professor at Michigan's Ross School of Business. He holds a PhD in behavioral decision research from my alma mater, Carnegie Mellon. Scott teaches courses on consumer behavior, judgment and decision-making, and marketing management. Scott has won awards for both research and teaching, no small feat, and his work has been covered in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, NPR, and more. Even more significantly, his work has been made at least one appearance on my blog, Neuromarketing. Scott's new book is Tightwads and Spendthrifts, Navigating the Money Minefield in Real Relationships. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's really great because it's so fun to connect with somebody. I think it was probably about 10 years ago or something that I wrote about your Tightwad and Spendthrift research, I think more than once. And so to connect at this point, to see you've got a book out about the whole topic is really wonderful. I'm curious, that kind of dates your work, but you've been working on Tightwads and Spendthrifts for a long time, Scott. How did you happen to go down that rabbit hole?
I'm a spendthrift raised by spendthrifts, and I started to notice kind of as I moved through life that not everybody had that orientation, and there were a bunch of tightwads in my midst, and I kind of got curious about these vast differences. And my research over the years has kind of tracked my own life developments. I married a tightwad and got interested in those differences in relationships, and now I'm doing work on how parents pass these on to kids, these tendencies. I have 3 kids of my own now, and so there's a me-search flavor to all of this.
Very interesting. I was excited to see that at CMU you work with George Lowenstein, who has been an early influencer of my neuromarketing blog and my original book, Brainfluence, although he might not be super excited to hear that since he is concerned about the ability to influence the behavior of consumers using the techniques of behavioral science and neuroscience. But I think it has to be done ethically, and we probably would not disagree on that. But one of his early topics was the pain of paying. Explain how that was sort of discovered, if you will, and what it is.
So the idea is that we're not always kind of carefully calculating what it is we're giving up later by spending now. And so instead of careful calculations, we might rely on gut feelings, kind of distress, feelings of anxiety, and those might serve as the brakes when we're thinking about spending money. And so that had been proposed to explain some odd patterns, like the fact that many people in the old days kind of preferred flat rate calling plans over kind of paying for each call, even though they would have saved by paying for each call. They didn't like the feeling of the meter running. And so it had been kind of an idea that was out there. And then I think the work that you noticed years ago was when we measured it in functional MRI, we had people shop while having their brain scanned, and we found some neural evidence consistent with distress kind of being a signal to the person saying, stop, maybe don't buy this.
And that certainly influences, decision-making. And we found that people were different, right? That some were felt this pain far more than others, I guess, like any other external stimuli. But, from a marketing standpoint, that's, I think, significant in multiple ways. First of all, looking at the product aspect, are there some products that you're only going to sell to spendthrifts and only sell to tightwads, do you think?
I think you can take many products and frame it one way or the other. Spendthrifts, we are really skilled at viewing a broad range of products as an investment in our kind of future well-being, whereas tightwads need more help to kind of get there and look at it that way. So like a massage, is it a pleasurable experience, or is it a investment in your future kind of comfort and productivity and happiness? And so spendthrifts can see it kind of both ways immediately, whereas tightwads need help with the framing of it. So there's a lot of ambiguity out there, and tightwads just kind of benefit from that kind of investment framing.
So if you're a marketer trying to craft an appealing message for a broad audience where you really don't know who's who, obviously if you're in a sales situation, a one-on-one sales situation, then that's really useful information. If you detect that you've got one type or the other, you can really either appeal if they're spendthrift to the, sort of hedonic aspects of what you're offering and some of the fun things, the prestige, the enjoyment, all of that, where if you're selling to a tightwad, then you're going to want to emphasize the long-term value and the fact you're not going to have to replace this thing or whatever the sort of the long-term benefit is that might justify the price. But if you're a marketer who is doing more or less mass marketing, how can you try and appeal to both? Should you be incorporating both types of elements in your message?
Marketers and retailers are good at trying to make all of us into spendthrifts, and things that are aimed at helping tightwads, they usually don't hurt spendthrifts. I mean, spendthrifts might not need that extra push. So really, it's in the retailers and the marketers' best interest to kind of think about how to loosen up tightwads. It's going to help with them and it's not going to hurt elsewhere. And when you look at the landscape, marketers, they're pretty good at it. They're pretty good at taking our attention away from the money leaving our possession and framing things in a way that makes it feel like, oh, this is a reasonable long-term investment. This is not a indulgence. So yeah, I think their attention should really be on the people on the tightwad end of things.
Thinking about it, it really sort of plays into the old advertising maxim that people buy an emotion, but they justify with logic. Which that typically means that you need both kinds of messaging in your advertising. If you're selling a cool sports car, you want to emphasize, how fun it is and sexy and everything else, but you also want to emphasize perhaps its economy, its lasting value, the fact that its resale value is higher than your typical sedan or whatever, because that way, even the spendthrift who has to justify the purchase to a tightwad spouse or friend or something has that ammunition. So really, I think it probably does work sort of across the board, right?
Yes, exactly. So they can justify it to themselves, but it's good to help them justify it when they get home and have to explain it to others. That's absolutely true.
Scott, you said that you're working on how these values are passed along through generations. And, I guess many of us had the experience of growing up with parents or grandparents who went through the Depression. And that is certainly a huge influence in some of my background. I expect that's one part of it. How much of this divide between tightwad and spendthrift is innate or sort of genetically inherited, if any of it is, or is it really all learned from one's environment and, whether it's parents or people you go to school with or work with or whatever?
I think there is something built in. I think that is a component of your capacity for mathematical thinking. Tightwads are more mathematical, I think sometimes to their detriment. And, your kind of tendency to ruminate about things, and that also helps with tightwadism. But I do think a lot of it is environment and how you're raised. And a lot of tightwads seem to have gone through a really hard moment in their life where they thought money was tight. Maybe money was tight, or they just felt it was tight, and they developed this protective shell to make sure they didn't overspend. And maybe that helped them get through a hard time. But for a lot of tightwads later in life, things loosened up. They looked better on paper financially, but they just didn't feel, they couldn't shed this kind of well-learned response. So there's a lot of tightwads who you would think they'd be quite comfortable spending if you just looked at their bank accounts, but they can't shake those earlier feelings they developed.
Is there an age range that you've discovered that seems to be significant, or is it just sort of an ongoing thing?
I don't have a precise answer. I mean, we've started measuring it in kids as young as 5. We have a scale for children. It does seem like adolescence is a big, important moment that seems to stick with people. And it doesn't manifest immediately. Like, you don't start looking like your parents when you go off to college because you're just not facing those decisions that they faced when you were growing up. But when you grow older and it is time to buy the house or decide where to send your kids to school, we do see that people start emulating what they saw earlier in life.
You keep talking about how logical and mathematical and whatnot. Does this sort of divide map a little bit between Kahneman's system 1 and system 2 decision making, where, there's system 1 being that sort of quick, emotional, fast, and system 2 being the more reason, logical type.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of interplay. Like tightwads are like too logical and they're too obsessed with what I'm giving up later, and I think that causes a lot of anxiety and feeling, and no, I just can't do this. It's like a quick decision no, when if they sat with it they might get to yes. So you can be kind of impulsive and be an impulsive no, not just impulsive like, yeah, I want to buy that. So it's yes, but it's a very interesting mix of the two.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. So actually, perhaps although one associates the tightwads with being very sort of rational and mathematical, but they might make some snap system 1 decisions by looking at a price tag or a product category and say, no, I don't need that. That's ridiculous. That's a waste of money, without actually analyzing it. Okay. Good explanation, Scott. I like that. We've got audience members from countries around the world. Are there cultural differences that you've seen where you have sort of, in entire cultures that seem to behave in one manner or the other, or at least differently from other cultures?
I'd love to do more research on that. I don't have much data. I will say that in Canada, we've done the survey there, and they tend to be more tightwad than our US respondents. And you certainly hear stories. Dutch people tell me that they're pretty tight. But no, I would love to learn more about that. I think the scale would need some kind of careful translating. We have this scale, a questionnaire to measure where people are. But it's a great question. But yeah, it's on my to-do list.
I would guess maybe, Scott, that some nations that went through periods of great deprivation, like after war, where, for a while people were starving, could barely get enough food to eat and so on, and had no resources, they might tend to behave kind of like the Depression people that we had in the U.S., where, those people who lived through the Depression and their kids really had this feeling of, wow, don't spend anything unnecessarily. And so I hope your research shows that. I would imagine you might find some differences if you do that. Now, you mentioned that you married a tightwad, right? And I understand that divide as well, although I don't think I fall really closely into one category or the other, but I probably have evolved into leaning towards spendthrift. But how not that this is a relationship advice show, but if you are in a relationship with somebody, how do you sort of navigate that divide where you're not constantly arguing about every purchase? Assuming you've solved that yourself, Scott.
We're doing okay on that, but it does need to be managed carefully. And I think bank account structure is one way to do it. So we have a system where we kind of launder all incoming money through a joint account. So it's all our money. There's no mine and yours. It's just all ours. And that helps to take attention away from income differences. And so you want to get away from scorekeeping, what we're each contributing to the relationship. But then on the back end of that joint account, we each have separate accounts where we each know how much we're moving from the joint into our separate accounts, but we're not getting into the details of what everyone's spending. I know you spend X per month, but I'm not doing like a line item inspection of what you're up to, and vice versa, because I think that gets into unnecessary arguments over little things, especially if you have mismatched spouses. So I call it kind of financial translucency instead of financial transparency. We each have a sense of what we're up to, but the details are just available upon request. And hopefully the requests are few and far between.
Right. Well, I guess that makes sense. Really what you're saying is you mix the money as it comes in. So you've got one big pot of money, and then you divide that in some appropriate way into individual accounts where those are really each person's business by and large. The individual expenses aren't really accountable to the other if they come out of that personal account. Now, if you were going to buy a new house, for example, then you probably have to negotiate that in some way. But that's actually, it seems like a very good idea. And maybe hopefully some of our listeners audience members on the video side can benefit from that. I like that a lot.
There's always time. We did an experiment with newlyweds, but I think I can help at any point if you want to retool. And it's just good to have some sense of individuality and we might have different hobbies and interests, and I might not understand the cost of your hobby. Let you enjoy it. I don't need to know those numbers. As long as it's not kind of tanking the family, have fun. Go for it.
Now, I guess too, Scott, you could have a business relationship that's had those same characteristics. And I doubt if you've, well, I guess you can explain if you've got any research on it, but, if you have two decision makers in a business, maybe they're partners in the same business, or, a CEO and COO or something like that, and they have very different approaches to things. Any ideas on how to sort that out too, so that, again, you're not constantly battling about, one wants to spend to expand and the other is saying, well, no, we need to, hoard our resources in case there's a downturn. Now, any ideas on that?
I think it's finding the appropriate division of labor and letting each one do what they're good at. You want a balance of both in a business, in a house, in any kind of joint venture. You don't want to necessarily, if you're looking to wow a client, you don't want to take them to Olive Garden, like, no offense, but you need to wine and dine. You got to spend money to make money sometimes. And so it's, if you want to expand and take chances, you need a bit of a spendthrift mentality. But, when I'm kind of keeping an eye on the books and making sure things aren't getting too wild, I'd love to have a tightwad voice in the room speaking up. So it's that balance of perspectives, I think, can be quite useful. It's just kind of putting people in the right places to kind of play to their strengths.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, maybe one possibility would be to also have third-party involvement in the entire process. In other words, a board that sets broad parameters. And, if ideally you shouldn't need a ton of rules, like, okay, you can go to a fancy restaurant if the client is this big or something like that. You don't want to get into that level of detail where people feel like their behavior is being totally controlled by rules. But, on the other hand, having an agreement overall that's established for the company of this is going to be our approach to the business, and maybe with a few examples here and there to sort of guide the decision making, that could be one way of doing that, because you can't really have separate accounts like you do in your relationship. But at least if there's sort of a third party that whether that third party is a board or a management committee or even just sort of a strategic plan, that might be one way to do that.
This might be too permissive for some companies, but I like the way Netflix phrases it. They say our expense policy is you spend in the best interests of Netflix.
Right. I highly recommend No Rules Rules. That's an excellent book. And I would say it's not necessarily an approach that's going to work for every company, because not every company can hire, really exceptional individuals who have that ability to navigate that sort of thing. If you've got a call center with 1,000 people in it, you can't just let them all do their thing. But on the other hand, for companies that are dealing with managerial people, technical people, that's really, I think, an excellent approach, because I sort of take the same approach when I talk about friction in businesses and unnecessary effort, wasted effort. And because when you are having people spend hours filling out expense reports or other bureaucratic forms, trying to justify every little detail, you're wasting their time. Not only are you wasting their time, they know you're wasting their time. And you're sort of telling them that, well, your time just isn't that important. We want you to do this thing so that, everything is done exactly according to the book. And, maybe, as Reed Hastings suggested, you ought to throw the book out and people get a lot more done, and maybe actually with responsibility might behave in a more responsible way. Because if you've got this very tight set of rules for anything, how you spend your expense report money, if you find, gee, I've got an X per diem here, or I can spend up to that amount per day. I haven't used it all. Maybe I'll go have an extra meal or something.
Right.
You don't want people doing that either. If you need to have a meal, if you need to take a client out, do it. But don't feel obligated to spend it just because you didn't hit your limit.
My approach in the book is very much in that spirit of kind of high trust. It is risky. I think my advice, if the couples are fighting and on thin ice, I'm not sure I would follow all my recommendations, like, oh, go in all in on a joint account, like that's risky. So my approach is for things that are couples that are going good, and maybe it could be even better.
Scott, over the years in your research, I'm sure you've had a few surprises in once you got to analyze your data. What would you say is one of the biggest surprises you've encountered?
I am often surprised at advice that I've seen in the world, and that kind of prompts ideas for projects to see, is that reasonable? I've seen advice about like retail therapy as like it's such a bad idea to shop to feel better. Like that just seemed like an obvious conclusion that everyone came to, everyone that I could find, everyone that was writing about it. And it just seems so at odds with my own experience, where I guess retail therapy has been helpful here and there over the years. And so when I see advice that seems wrong, it prompts me to kind of study the topic more closely. And, I have some work showing that shopping can help with feelings of sadness, can help you recover more quickly from those feelings. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It can even be kind of hypothetical shopping, but it does help to restore a sense of choice and personal control. And that's what's missing when we're sad. So yeah, I think I let myself kind of just consume what's out there, kind of what are people talking about? What are they advising others to do? And I react, and the research kind of goes from there.
What do you mean by hypothetical shopping, Scott?
We would have a study, for instance, where you go through the motions, you kind of drag things into your cart, but this is just that you're not going to get any of these items. It's just kind of simulated shopping. But we also did kind of low stakes shopping that worked too. Certainly retail therapy can get out of hand if you kind of go off the deep end and get yourself in debt, and that's going to make you even more sad. I'm not advocating that, but kind of isolated, responsible shopping that actually can help with sadness.
Yeah, I can see that. Just even a small purchase of something that interests you. Like I kind of collect travel gear. I don't collect it, but I mean, I'm always looking for something that's a little bit better than whatever I've got right now. And it could be something as, a little cable adapter or something. But if I see one that's a little bit better and buy it, I mean, to me, that's the sort of thing that can cheer you up. I'm not usually troubled by feelings of sadness, but I can imagine that, a small purchase like that can be a little bit of a mood enhancer.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't help with things like anger. So it's kind of a narrow band of bad feelings it can help with, but it's just, I felt it was kind of a necessary counterpoint to all the kind of very general advice I was seeing out there.
Scott, yeah, if there is one takeaway from your book that you'd like people to go away with, what would that be?
So, I mean, for individuals, you can change your own habits. You can, I say that, everyone's trying to influence us. You can take the principles that marketers and retailers use to influence you and use it to influence yourself by either kind of turning up or down the dial in terms of the psychological speed bumps you put up to spending. You can put up more or you can put up less depending on what you need to do. And then for couples, that too can be managed. Like if just a simple rearrangement of bank account structures can really have profound effects. You often hear people saying, oh, when people fight over money, they're actually fighting over something more fundamental. The money's just this superficial layer. And that can be true. But sometimes it is about the money. The money can create psychological dynamics that wouldn't be there otherwise. And so you can change that. You can change how the money moves and how things are monitored and really have a better relationship.
That's great. Scott, how can people find you and your ideas online?
You can go to scottrick.com, and there you can find the research I've done and that kind of inspired the book. And, there's a link to the book and all that.
Fantastic. Scott, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.